Welcome to this GCSE presentation on the aerobic and the anaerobic systems for generating energy for exercise, for training and for performance. So I guess the first thing we want to do is we just need to understand our terms, right? First of all, when we talk about aerobic, we mean by that with or in the presence of oxygen, with O2. So that's kind of all that aerobic means really. What we can see here is we've also got the term aerobic in anaerobic, but we've got this "an" bit at the start. So we know it's something to do with oxygen. So what does the "an" bit actually means? It means not or negative. So therefore, what we end up with is not with O2. So when we start to look at different types of exercise, we can broadly categorize them into either being aerobic in the sense that the majority of the energy is produced in the presence of oxygen, or we can consider them to be anaerobic. The majority of the energy is produced not in the presence of oxygen. And we can kind of deem this on two main considerations. So we have to kind of consider two things as to whether, to be able to judge whether an exercise is aerobic predominantly, or the majority is aerobic, or the majority is anaerobic. Because do remember, they do work simultaneously together. So we have to take into account the duration of the exercise. The duration, that's how long the exercise lasts for. And we need to take into account the intensity of the exercise. Basically, how hard is the work that's being done? You know, is it, for example, a sprint, which would be very high intensity, or is it let's say a jog, for want of a better term, which is lower to moderate intensity? So we can use these concepts to judge whether an activity is aerobic or anaerobic. So let's take this image here. I believe it's from the Paralympics in 2008, and we're going to argue that this image is a let me just get rid of that, is a 10,000 meter run. So it's a 10-kilometer run, and this is the final of the 10 kilometers, 10,000 meters in the Paralympic final in Beijing in 2008. So the first thing we want to say about this is it's relatively long duration, right? I mean, these guys are going to be running this particular exercise for tens of minutes. So the first thing we can say is it's absolutely, definitely aerobic. It is an aerobic exercise because the duration is longer and the intensity, we might sort of say, generally speaking, it's a little bit lower, right? It's still, you know, they're still sort of running hard, but the intensity is lower than it would be for something like sprinting, maybe with the exception of like the last couple of laps, right? They often speed up, don't they? So as a result of it being aerobic, look what we said right at the start, we can say that the energy is produced with oxygen. Okay, so that's helpful. We've got that here, with oxygen. That's what we mean by aerobic. And we can also say that this kind of system is developed, or it's actually in evidence in some kind of continuous activity. Continuous activity. So we know that with this, right? These guys, they run round that loop over and over and over and over and over again until they come to 10,000 meters. And it's a continuous exercise based on that concept. Do remember, I mean, we're actually going to come up to it in a couple of lessons' time, that we've even got a form of training which is called continuous training, which is based on this concept of keeping going, rhythmical exercise, running, swimming, cycling, rowing, these kind of exercises. So what about the intensity? This is maybe where we're going to get a little bit more of the challenge. Well, we're first of all going to measure intensity by what is the percentage of maximum heart rate. What's the percentage, put percentage in, of maximum heart rate? And for aerobic work, we're going to argue that it's something along the lines of 60 to 80% heart rate max. Okay, so 60 to 8%. If you're exercising within that zone, you are working aerobically. So ever so quickly, let's just put in some additional examples. We know we've got our 10,000 meters. What others would be classics? Well, we know we've got things like marathon. You could talk about things like road cycling. I mean, it could be track cycling over the longer distances, but, you know, road cycling is certainly over the longer duration. We might talk about something such as walking to school. I mean, it doesn't sound so stressful and so hard work, but that's kind of the lifestyle side of this, right? Like the health side of this. Walking to school is an aerobic exercise, and if built into a daily rhythm, every day will be good for your fitness, for example. And look at this last one I'm going to put in. Being on your feet all day. Being on your feet all day. So, you know, if you're doing some kind of manual job, or if you work and you have to stand up, then we can consider that aerobic exercise. And the last one I want to put into this, and this is kind of an interesting thought, and I'll leave you to consider this one. Any kind of recovery period is also aerobic. So if you see a sprinter, for example, belting it down a 100-meter track, and they basically don't breathe in that performance, so it's definitely not aerobic exercise, but afterwards, they're interviewed on a TV or whatever, you'll hear them going in other words, with oxygen the recovery takes place. Okay, let's move on to our other anaerobic, and here I've got the example of a 400-meter run here, and I want you to link anaerobic work very clearly to the lesson we've done on lactic acid, because it's really one and the same topic. They're not separate, so think about them as a united topic. So we already know that this 400 meters, broadly speaking, or the majority of energy, is without oxygen, and we've got that here, right? Without, not with oxygen, without oxygen. So it's an anaerobic exercise. We also say that it's high intensity. Okay, so I'm going to mention this in terms of training. We can therefore think about the type of training that would be necessary is HIIT training, high intensity training. This is high intensity work. Now, what would the actual intensity be? Well, we're going to make an argument that anything from 80 to 90% max heart rate is going to be anaerobic, but basically consider it anything above 80%, 80 to 100% in reality, you can get up there sometimes, is going to be considered predominantly anaerobic. And one of the inevitabilities, or one of the things that absolutely has to happen if we do anaerobic work, it's absolutely going to happen, is that the exercise, or that particular intensity of exercise, is going to be short duration. You cannot sustain anaerobic work for long periods of time. And the reason that that is the case is that we produce, as I said before, lactic acid. And that lactic acid is fatiguing, it slows us down, it causes pain, it causes heaviness, and ultimately we have to reduce the intensity of our training or our exercise or our performance because that lactic acid sets in. Okay, very last thing from me. Let me just sketch something out to you. It's going to be a little bit scruffy, but let me just sketch out what we'd call a heart rate block. So what we've got here is we've got a continuum of heart rate. So this is our percentage of heart rate. So up here, we've got, this is 100% of our max heart rate, or 100% of our heart rate range, and down here is going to be 0%. That's obviously dead, so we're not too worried about that. But what we can say is that basically speaking, from 0 to 50%, this area here, this is 50%, 50% of your maximum heart rate, then what we, in fact, let me put the word max in there, percentage maximum heart rate, 50% of your maximum heart rate, this is rest. Okay, so this is like you're sitting watching this video now, presumably, you're somewhere in that zone. We've then got a little zone of 50 to 60%, maybe just change colour. We've got this zone here, so this is going to be 60%. We'd consider this to be, once we start exercising, we consider this to be fat burning, FB, fat burning zone. Now then, we know now that between 60 and 80%, we know that this is our aerobic zone, because we just talked about it. There's our aerobic zone in there, 60 to 80%. So there's the 80. And now we've got a situation where we've got 80 to 90%. And now in here we've got anaerobic. Can't really write that in there, but you get the idea. Anaerobic. So that's the anaerobic zone in there. And of course we can in reality continue that up to 100%. Okay. There's 90 there. Okay, so that's what we mean by the aerobic and the anaerobic energy systems. They're useful things to understand. This is an interesting little way of depicting it. Thanks for listening. Take care.